All right, so this is going to be video one for the weekend of April 21st and 22nd. We're picking up with the foreign policy of Reagan. We just finished talking about Star Wars SDI. So looking at other various foreign policy involvement with Reagan, first we have Grenada. In October of 1983, Reagan sent Marines to this island to remove a pro-Cuban communist regime, going back to his whole, anti-communist Cold War rhetoric, that was recently installed in a coup. U.S. was successful. We got in and out. We didn't do any kind of long-term fight here like we did in Vietnam, so it was an in-and-out mission and got it done. But it's an example of how he's being staunchly anti-communist. Then you also have the very famous Iran-Contra affair that takes place. This almost derailed Reagan's presidency and almost cost him to lose. I'd say we got impeached. It's not as big as Watergate, but still a big deal. So it was the biggest scandal since Watergate, and there's a lot of moving parts here, so I'm kind of explain what's happening. Iran and Iraq were fighting since 1980, so Iran and Iraq were in a war with each other at the time. Reagan's aides developed a secret plan to sell anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran's government for help to help release American hostages that were held by radical Arab groups. So basically what happened was in the early 80s, there was an Iranian terrorist group who took some Americans hostage. This is not the hostage crisis from before. There was only it was fewer than 10 Americans who got captured, but these were Americans who were kind of traveling in the Middle Eastern region who were captured by this Iranian hostage group, or this Iranian terrorist group who took these guys hostage. Anyway, we want to get these guys released. So at the same time, you have a fight going on in Nicaragua. So you have the Iranian versus Iraq situation with American hostages being held by terrorists. Then you have another situation going on with Nicaragua. In 1979, there's this new government that takes over in Nicaragua, which is in Central America, called the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas were the new government that took over in 1979, and they were a pro-Cuban, pro-communist government. There was a rebel group fighting against them called the Contras. That's where the Contra part comes in. So Contras were these rebel groups that we were supporting early on. We actually used the CIA to try to train and give these guys weapons early on in 81, 82. But because a lot of the money was going to this was from the cocaine trade, Congress shut it down. So in 1982, Congress shut down as giving any kind of money or aid to the Contras fighting against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So some of Reagan's aides thought, okay, if we sell weapons to the Iranians, and that would help us get the hostages out. And we'll take some of that money that's supposed to go towards the weapons, and we'll give it to the Contras secretly, even though Congress told them not to. So aides then used the profits from the Iranian gun sale to pay the Contras Nicaragua behind Congress's back. Reagan denied the knowledge of illegal diversions of funds, which violates Congress's authority, because Congress's power here is the power of purse. They're the ones who get to decide how money gets spent. And so it's like the executive branch, because he's commander-in-chief and because he can sell weapons because he's commander-in-chief, are finding a loophole in the Constitution by selling weapons. They're trying to take money and divert it over to the Contras. Anyway, whenever it was all said and done, there was some of Nixon's some of Reagan's aides who do end up getting accused of abuse of power, who are found guilty. There was never enough proof that what Reagan knew and did not know, so Reagan never got really held accountable. But the negative aspect of this is that it did look like he had a poor sense of leadership, and he wasn't able to control the people underneath him. So it does kind of hurt his image and reputation. And this all gets finalized in 1987, right before his second term ends. It does tarnish his reputation some, but not enough to make him that unlikable, because he's still one of the highest rated presidents we've ever had going out of office. So that's the Iran-Contra affair, which is the biggest scandal since Watergate, but not quite as big, and Reagan comes out pretty unscathed from it all. And here you see one of the Marines involved in this, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He was involved in all this and testified what he knew and did not know, and that's a famous image from the Iran-Contra affair. Then you have the Lebanon, Israel, and PLO situation. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to stop the PLO terrorists. So I mentioned the PLO the other day. The PLO were this group that formed in the 60s called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Back in its earlier time period, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were regarded as a terrorist group. The PLO's whole goal was to make Israel Palestine. Basically, they wanted to kick out and remove the Jewish folks who had moved in there since the 1940s, and they wanted to make it a Palestine. So the PLO formed to do this back in the 60s, but they used terrorist-type activities to achieve their goals. Some of the PLO operatives were staying and living in South Lebanon, and they were using that as a home base to go attack into Israel. And so in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to basically go after the PLO, which could create this giant Middle Eastern conflict. So in 82, the United States and others soon got involved to help evacuate PLO folks out of there to safety, because some of the people there were also women and children. And while we were there in April of 83, a suicide bomber went up to an American embassy and killed 63 people. So while we were there in April of 83, a suicide bomber went to the U.S. embassy there and killed 63 people. Months later, a terrorist drove a bomb truck into a Marines barrack, a U.S. Marines barrack in Lebanon, and killed 240 Marines. So while we're there kind of acting as this police force, we get attacked by terrorists, which kind of turns us off to the whole situation. By 84, us and the coalition forces that went to Lebanon all withdrew. We all kind of walked away because it was apparent we were not going to be able to resolve this conflict. But we tried to go there and resolve it, and we had some Americans get killed in the process. But the most likely thing you're going to have any kind of questions about would be the improved U.S.-Soviet relations under Reagan. So you might have questions about Iran-Contra because it is another scandal, makes people look bad on the government. But if you have a question about Reagan specifically, it's probably going to be about those Soviet relations for foreign policy. So a very big change comes in 85 whenever the Soviets get a new leader named Mikhail Gorbachev. This is him right here. Gorbachev becomes the new leader of the Soviets in 1985. The Soviets were kind of unstable with their leadership for the first few years of Reagan because Brezhnev died in early 81, and like two more leaders came into power and they died fairly quickly, so they didn't have a stable leadership there. And Gorbachev became their leader in 85. And honestly, because of his reforms, he probably has more to do with the end of the Cold War than anything else, because he makes some major reforms to try to compete with the changing world that they live in, and with Americans being more hardline now with Reagan. So he does a lot to try to change the way the Soviets deal with things, and that's going to the reforms he creates are going to lead to the collapse of the Soviets. So the two big reforms that he creates are perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means restructuring in Russian. This is where you have a restructuring of the Soviet economy with limited free market practices and Soviet politics with limited local voting. So what this means is that you have some allowance of small-scale democracy where you vote for local leaders. Also, for the economic side, you allow for the demonopolization of their government, to where now you have local businesses essentially allowed to run by individuals. So you have local businesses now can be allowed to be run by individuals and make profits off of. So small-scale capitalism introduced as well. The second reform is called glasnost, which is this one right here. This one means openness. Glasnost means openness. Openness to end political repression and move towards less censorship and more freedom of expression. So basically what glasnost does is allow the press and people to speak their minds more, speak out against the government. They can begin to reveal some of the bad things that have happened with the government. And so by introducing these two very important reforms, people are now finally able to say what they feel. And if they're able to say what they feel about the government, that's going to eventually have to force the government to have to change. It's also going to, when people are allowed to make their own profits through small-scale capitalism, have a say in local voting, it's going to increase their demands for more rights and more say in government, period. And so those two reforms especially helped lead to an end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union collapsing from the inside, not too much Reagan, but from the inside itself. But because Gorbachev is now in power, he's going to be much more willing to make deals with Reagan. And he wants to work towards ending the arms race. So in 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev will reduce certain types of nuclear weapons with the INF Treaty. It stands for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So INF stands for Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Gorbachev and Reagan signed this in 1987 to reduce those types of missiles in the arms race. And finally, by 1988, Soviets left Afghanistan, which also helped reduce tensions too. So Soviets had also left Afghanistan by 1988 as well. This had a lot to do with the fall of the Soviet economy. By 1989, relations vastly had improved between the two superpowers, and the end of the Cold War seemed very near, which will happen under the first Bush 91. The last thing I need to talk about is Poland solidarity, which is kind of related to America. But in Poland, in the early 80s, you're going to see one of the first successful trade unions form called Solidarity. Solidarity was this trade union that formed as a way to fight for workers' rights. And of course, if you're a communist country, you don't want to have a successful trade union underneath you because it gives too much power to people. And so we've seen other examples in history where the Soviets, anytime there's any whiff of revolt in these Eastern European countries they controlled, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and stuff, they cracked down on it. Like Hungary tried this in the 50s, and they cracked down on it. Czechoslovakia had this happen in the 60s, they cracked down on it. But here you have an uprising of this political movement with Solidarity, and the Soviets don't do anything to stop it. And so Solidarity, even though they face a lot of opposition, continues to fight against its government, and it will survive throughout the 80s and becomes a powerful voice for regular people. And so here you have the Polish Soviet dictatorship being now challenged by a group of people that are just regular people, and it's going to eventually lead to other Eastern European countries to do the same thing. And this is what in a lot of ways helps lead to the end of the Cold War or the Eastern Bloc in East Europe. So those Soviet nations, the satellite nations in East Europe, begin to fall apart by the late 80s because of influence by Solidarity. So it's going to be the first independent union in a communist country, and inspired many and formed a basis of a nonviolent anti-communist movement in East Europe. And so by 88, 89, pretty much all those Eastern European countries that were once under the control of the Soviets are now going to begin to break away from the Warsaw Pact and become independent nations, and not stay dictatorships or communists any longer. So that'll be the end of